Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing an incredibly interesting book that I read that I actually picked up on a whim. I was exiting the library and I was going to walk to the checkouts at the library and I was walking past shelves of books. I saw this one sitting and it looked interesting and I pulled it out and it wound up being a very, very interesting read that I highly recommend. So let's dive in. So the book in question is The Edge of Memory, Ancient Stories, Oral Traditions, and the Post-Glacial World. And this is by Patrick Nunn. So the premise of this book that the author puts forward is that as people who live in a literate society, so people who live in a world where writing is very, very important and that's how we transmit a lot of our information, oral traditions have kind of fallen by the wayside and we tend to discredit those oral traditions as being not very reliable. And evidenced by the fact that we're literally reading a book about oral traditions kind of tells you how we rank importance. And he makes a point a little later on in the book that most of us, we learned to read in school, and then by reading we acquired a lot of that knowledge in school instead of, for example, sitting down and listening to our grandparents or other older people in our lives pass that knowledge on down to us. There's kind of a way that we pass knowledge along. And while the author admits there's a lot of benefits that come with writing and it's been a very good, wonderful, advantageous thing for humans to create and use in their life, when we discredit oral traditions, we're discrediting a lot of interesting information and things that have been scientifically backed up. So the author really spends the first part of the book discussing rising sea levels that occurred after the last ice age, particularly in Australia with the Aboriginal groups in Australia. And he spends probably the first chapter going through what they remember and how low the sea would have to be accurate to remember it. And I thought this was so interesting. And it was something that I had no idea existed. And like he said, we tend to be in a society that values the written word. So these oral traditions tend to be discarded as, or not discarded, but they're classified as myths or just interesting, fun, or interesting culturally relevant stories, but maybe not necessarily anything that has scientific weight or that discusses things that actually occurred in the past. But he goes to he convincingly shows that these stories actually transmit information about things that occurred in the past, such as volcanoes exploding or different beasts that lived, or the sea sinking, or times when the sea was lower, or times when the sea was raising up and then cutting off a lot of the land paths between places that previously existed or completely covering places where people previously had lived, which I thought was very, very interesting and well done. So I really enjoyed this book. It's about 200 pages, but I think it does skew more towards academic versus like a casual reader. So I do think even though it's a little under 200 pages or like right around 200 pages, make sure that you give yourself plenty of time to read it because there's a lot of interesting information, a lot of interesting graphs and charts that you're going to want to take enough appropriate time to look through and read through and understand. The second thing that I want to point out is the notes. So there's a lot of notes in this book, the note section at the back, and usually I find that the notes are a really good place to go and find additional reading. So if something in the book caught my attention or I want to read further, then I go and find the notes for that section and I add the books to my reading list, or I find some other way to get that information, whether it's like a web page or a news article. I find it's a really good way, especially nonfiction books, to kind of expand. It's like having recommendations given to you right there in the book. So if the author's kind of saying, well, the author is citing their sources, but also kind of saying, oh, if you enjoyed this, then you might also enjoy this because this is where it references. So it's kind of an easy way to find additional reading. So this author obviously is using the notes to kind of cite his sources and discuss where he's pulling this information from, but also there's like a whole second book in the notes where there's so much interesting information just packed in here instead of just the citation. So if you reach the end of the book and you see the notes page, keep reading because you have a whole another book back here of interesting notes to read, and I'm guessing that if you enjoyed the book, you're going to find a lot of other books listed listed in the notes section that might be added to your reading list and you can enjoy. I wound up giving this a 4-star rating. I really enjoyed this, thought it was so interesting. For a book that I just picked up on a whim, it was very educational. I knew nothing about it. I've definitely added some books from the notes section to the to my reading list, and I think that it kind of pointed out how by living in a society that prioritizes or prefers written transmission of knowledge, maybe I inadvertently have my own biases about dismissing oral traditions when there's actually a lot of really interesting information in this. So I learned a lot. Again, it's by page count kind of a shorter book, but there's a ton of information packed in here, and I think if anything that I said is interesting to you, then you should check out this book. Again, that's The Edge of Memory. I think you would really enjoy it. I really enjoyed it, and I have actually recommended it to some people since I've read it. So I'm hoping they read it so we can discuss, and I hope that if you read this, you can let me know what you think about it. So yeah, I can see your thoughts and opinions on that. On that, everyone, thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day.